Well, there we go. Bumpy start, but here we are at the first ever Weight Watchers show. And thank you absolutely to the Alchemie Network, to Alex and Harold for letting us have this monthly show. I'm Terry Corby. Many of you will know me. Some of you won't. I'm the founder and CEO of Good Business Pays, the campaign organization set up 4 years ago to bring an end to slow and late payment to small businesses. When Alex and I talked about having a Weight Watchers show on this channel, with the play on words, of course, with weight. I know I do need to lose a little bit of weight, but we're talking about WAI on this occasion. It's all about waiting to get paid. And so guest today, we will be joined by George Booth, who's the Chief Procurement Officer at Lloyds Banking Group, huge responsibility at the biggest bank. By Jamie Radford, who has been a CPO in his own right, but for many years the Chief Executive of the Accounts Payable Association and Finance Disruptor. So we're looking forward to lots of disruptive comments from Jamie, and of course from Alex himself, the founder of the network. I wanted these shows, unlike some of the interviews that we do, to be a bit of a debate, a bit of a discussion. To light a fire under things. It's the procurement network, and in the 4 years that I've been doing this job, I've met many procurement people, and they're not backward in terms of coming forward with their views. So let's have your views, viewers. There are many viewers here today that are watching live, but there'll be many more that come in afterwards as well. So if you've got a question, put it in the chat. We'll make sure the panel gets to answer it for you. And if we can't answer it in the show, then we'll answer it afterwards. Welcome to our two guests so far. Third one we'll welcome when he comes back in. The first question I really wanted to ask was, and you both know that Good Business Pays has been banging a drum for 4 years now, shining a light on those companies that pay well being fast in my world, of course, and badly being slow or late in my world, my view, of course. We've been doing that for 4 years. Why do we need a Weight Watchers show? Why do we need a Weight Watchers program? Jamie, tell us why we need this program at all. Is it worth it?
Well, other than, just to get rid of a bit of Christmas weight. I totally agree, Terry. I think we're a big supporter of yours, as you know, Terry, and we have been for many a year. The reality comes down to organisations say they do the right thing, and then sometimes the reality comes in. They're not probably doing the right thing in terms of paying people on time. Now, you're aware, Terry, we don't like the terminology faster. In the world of payables, accounts payable, faster, and actually in procurement somewhat, can lead you down the road of risk, fraud, error. So we like the terminology play on time and actually maybe pay in advance or a little ahead of time. Our industry, as you know, we support globally. We're now the largest payables association, and we represent members large and small. And one of the challenges, and the reason why not only your network, but this show is really important, is that I think there's a communication issue here somewhat. I think the larger business don't communicate very well with the smaller organizations on the process of how to, get a purchase order and the invoicing process and getting paid. And the smaller organizations probably don't do enough to engage and learn and sort of communicate their challenges. So I think you're the conduit that holds this together, Terry. So I think the show's definitely needed as long as it gets to the right people. So hopefully the idea with Alex and the network is to promote and push not only into procurement folk, but business owners, large and small, CPOs, CFOs, CEOs. We all need to hear the same message, because the reality comes down to, I think we all want to do the right thing culturally and behaviorally, but it comes down to education and communication.
I saw Alex raise an eyebrow when you said about fast. Used the word fast, not liking it, and I know Alex has worked in organisations that have a variable reputation around payment culture. Well, why did you raise an eyebrow when Jamie talked about fast?
Yeah, I think we've gone through a period now where there's been a lot of consulting firms talking to CFOs and getting through the door on the back of, we can improve your cash position. We can, and there are many ways in which they do that. They'll look at removing inventory. They'll look at making your process more efficient and more effective. They'll look at you managing your warehousing and what you order and how you order it. But they will also come in and say, your DPO can be improved, so your days payables. And they will be looking through all of their suppliers, first of all, and they'll be looking to take them all to the maximum. Okay, so that's the first thing. So there's this kind of culture where annually, quite often, there are targets set on procurement teams, normally from finance, normally from the CEO, where they're saying, we need you to improve your DPO by 2 days or 3 days next year. So there's already a culture of, when you go back to negotiate, we want longer terms. That's the first thing. Okay, so that is a culture that exists. That's kind of okay as long as both parties agree to the new date. Okay, so as long as everyone's in agreement with it and they have an expectation that whether it's 50 days or 60 days or 90 days, that's fine as long as everybody is now in agreement with that. We then, though, have non-adherence to that, and that's where the biggest problem for me is. That's the first thing that needs to be fixed, and that can be through incompetence or mismatch. So if there is a mismatch in the invoicing process and it results in a non-automatic payment, then how you deal with that needs to be. So I've worked for companies where, so when I was at Toyota, they would get you in on a weekend to resolve invoice issues, invoice queries, because you have made an honorable agreement with a supplier, and it's your responsibility to get it fixed so as you can pay on time. But I've also worked for companies where there has been a lax, and it can take 30 days, 45 days to go through that process of, it needs to be booked in. Did you receive it? The price is wrong. The quantity is wrong. And that's a problem. And the other issue is the pressure that companies are put under, and the way we have targets that are set internally around profitability targets, but often a lot of bonuses that businesses have are based around days payable or cash. And certainly the last organizations that I've worked in, 50% of the bonus for everybody was based around cash generation. And at a time when interest rates are very high, like they are now, there's more pressure on that. So I've also had experiences where getting into end of October or November, it's right, okay, we don't know whether we're going to land at year end. For the moment, stop paying. And there's a deliberate stopping of payment. And you kind of, as a procurement people, well, what do you want me to do? It's like, well, turn your phone off. Like it's really that. And I've had periods of time when, you know, from kind of the 20th of December until December 31st, I have kind of gone AWOL because you've got nothing to answer them. Now, often you get to the 31st of December and suddenly they find a load of customers that weren't expecting to pay have paid, and you can get rid of the cash and the invoices are cleared. But that's no way, for me, I don't think that's a good way to do business. The damage it does to the relationship is huge. And, you know, if you do that in December, knowing that there's a new contract to be negotiated in March, it's a tough position, both on price, both on terms, both on, are you a partner or not? And we're left to, in procurement, often we're left to just tidy up the mess. And Jamie, there's a lot of smiling going on from you during that conversation. But those are some of the things that procurement people are kind of left with to deal with.
Yeah. And by the way, I can see from Harold's notes that George is listening to us. You're welcome, George. I'm sorry you've got some tech problems, but I know you'll have views on everything we're talking about. So please type them in the chat there if you can, and we'll make sure we include you, even though we can't see you or hear you. Alex, you've covered a lot of different areas there in terms of, you know, this is the reality of the world of procurement. Quite a while ago, and I think, Jamie, you shared this with me when I first started learning about payment culture, we were talking about the difference between a procurement team that reports into finance and when it reports into, let's say, supply chain, I think it might be called, where there's more emphasis on value and the total value of the relationship and the contract, whereas when it reports to finance, it tends to be the pressures that you talked about, the bean counting pressures, may I call it. What's your view on that, Alex? Supply chain versus finance. Does it make any difference, or is it just a cultural thing?
I think I don't. First of all, I think procurement should have its own seat and not report into either of those. But that's another debate. I personally, I don't think it matters per se. I think what drives it is normally the bonus culture. So if there is a measurement of the company, it doesn't matter whether you report to supply chain or finance, you'll be hauled in to say, if we don't meet this cash target, nobody in this room gets their bonus. You understand that, Alex, don't you? Nobody in this room gets their bonus, and it's because of you. And it's
wow. Is that
and there's a discussion in here where Bavia has said WAPT. I'm not sure what that stands for, but it's a kind of pressure on procurement and a lot of AP in a lot of companies. He said it's happening every quarter in a lot of companies. Payments stop and don't respond to calls or emails. So some of this is at certain times of the year. It's when it happens.
Yeah. Alex, can you invite George as a speaker? I think he might be back in the holding position. So have another go. What do you think about so as accounts payable? I know you're trying to beef up the community account. Are they also paid bonuses on paying suppliers late?
Absolutely not. And I think, look, Alex's point is really valid. At a C-suite level and below, the directive may be cash optimization. It might be, look, we've got cash targets and there might be bonuses attached. And that could be the reality. I've worked for lots of corporates. I've been director of procurement and director of finance. So I've been in both roles. The reality is it's the organisation that's driving this.
Has that come through, George? Anything?
Yeah, George is in. But the reality comes down to what the organisation decide to do. And I think the comment in the chat here is some organisations have a quarterly target and they are constantly putting suppliers on sort of different payment terms so that the ones advertised. The reality, that's not great for procurement, let's be honest, because that's hits the relationship. There's a trust element that goes out the door clearly because you're then constantly letting your suppliers down. From a payables perspective, it's the worst thing ever because Alex is absolutely right. Procurement folk probably turn their phones off. I don't know. We don't get a choice in payables. We're on 24/7 and we're at the cutting edge. So we're the ones that are told your account's now going on stop. You're going on hold. We're going, down the debt collecting route. We don't care if it's Christmas or whatever, it's year end. The reality comes down to you've got junior people, especially in the payables world, who have no idea what's been agreed at C-suite downwards. That they're on the front end. They're dealing with suppliers every day and telling them what they know, which is what the system tells them. It's up there ready to be paid. It's on the next payment run, for instance. The reality also hits in a little bit there, which I think Alex touched on, the process and the complexity around process. And now I know that, I'm pretty sure that George will have an opinion on this. The reality on processes generally are a challenge in procurements and payables. People not understanding, not raising enough on requisitions, orders, not understanding the end-to-end, not adhering to internal processes. Before you even talk to a supplier, you've got internal challenges, which really comes against you. So culturally, yes, there could be organizations that absolutely use supply chain as a cash optimization because of high interest rates. But actually, you've also got to fix the internal processes people go through to even get the invoice to payment status in the first place. But I know George has joined us. You may want to pass that over to George now, Terry.
Well, I know that you'll have an opinion on what you've been listening to. George, do you pay all of your staff bonuses on the basis of paying your suppliers longer and later?
Well, my bonus and a number of my team is reflected in how well we pay our suppliers. And I think all the good points made, if I try and pull them together, there's kind of three basic steps for me. One is setting out what it is your terms are very clearly and paying to these terms. The faster they go, the better. But if you're paying net 30, net 40, 50, 20, 10, whatever. Second thing is having internal process clarity. So what we try and do is push our suppliers to give us as automated a run against our POs as possible, right? So when we 2 or 3 way match it, if we can get that electronically in, our policy is to pay immediately when we can. So our average payment days have come down to about 11. Now, we've taken a very conscious decision around cash flow management in that there is more to be had in the relationships with the suppliers we can build if we pay them as fast as we're able. Not every company is in that position. And I guess the third part to the point made is when things go wrong, get on it in a triage mentality, because cash is king, right? Where you've got your goods or services already consumed, you should pay the cash. And I always have the mindset of, if your salary wasn't in the bank every week or at the end of the month, how long would you wait before you withdraw your labor? Now, not every supplier is in a position to do that, but last I looked, 50-odd thousand suppliers in the UK over the last 12 months failed because of cash flow issues. It's not because they don't have a good product or a good team or the good service. They just don't have the cash to pay the bills, right? So one of our big drivers as a large bank in the UK is helping Britain prosper. And right at the start of that, where we've got clients who are also suppliers, we've taken a very proactive view to fix these 3 points. So we're very clear. We try and get the suppliers to invoice us correctly through the most automated, efficient path. And when it goes wrong, which it often does, we triage it, get on it very quickly and fix it. And then we learn constantly back. Hence, we're hitting, I think it was 97% to terms last year and average of 11 days, right? I mean, and I know amongst the peers, that's pretty good.
Yeah, and I think here's where we get into the employee point, which you've made on a number of occasions when we've chatted, which is, what would you think if you didn't get paid your salary at the end of the month? Takes me into the area of contract fairness, right, versus speed, right? So we might say, well, if you've got a 60 or a 90 or 120 day term contract and you get paid on time, what are you complaining about, right? You got paid on time. But what's the difference between fairness and in particular, not just fairness for doing the right thing, but fairness to help smaller businesses and medium ones prosper and grow? Alex, what do you think about that, fairness versus speed?
Look, I think there are 2 issues. One is a moral issue, and as we head into periods where organisations are now being measured more on their kind of supply diversity and having targets set around having some of their spend positioned towards smaller and medium-sized enterprises, then we need to have a philosophy, in my opinion, that focuses the contract point on fairness. The failure to pay on time because of incompetence or process problems or time of the year, we're going to manage this, is another issue. I think the starting point is a contract should be fair. And when you enter into it, just because someone agrees to it doesn't mean it's fair. And, well, our policy is 90 days. Okay, but that's just not fair for some companies, and it will damage them. And every time they look to grow their business with you on terms like that, a lot of the small companies just can't cope. So we shouldn't have a one fits all agreement. So one FTSE 100 company to another FTSE 100 company, you can really have whatever terms you want because you should be able to manage it within your corporation. But if you're a FTSE 100 company or 250 company and you're dealing with a small organization with 20 to 50 employees, then you should be thinking differently, and you shouldn't have our terms are discussion with that type of company, because it's in my opinion, it's inappropriate.
That's a great point, Alex. And to bring it to life a bit, I increasingly believe that supply chains compete, not companies. And what I mean by that is, behind every company, whether you're selling services or products, you've got a supply chain of many hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers all around the world. Some of these are very well established, big corporate brands that we know of, but others are brand new or are just emerging or have not yet formalized themselves as a company. And when we meet them, like we call them like fintechs in banking, so financial technology companies, often they might be 2 or 3 people. And we're asking them, oh, sorry, we've got a fire alarm here.
I shouldn't laugh, sorry.
Let me go on mute, I'll exit and carry on. Hang on.
What do you think, JB? You're nodding.
Yeah, look. I think both points from George and Alex is really important, but I think that the crux of it is, Terry, in your world, you want to fix this issue. Let's be honest. The reality is there's lots of challenges. It's people, process, but it comes from the very top. Let's be brutally honest here. The very top of an organization dictates the culture, dictates the process, dictates the training, if anything. And it sounds like, in George's world, in Lloyds Bank, they've got a good culture, they've got good process, good trained, well-trained people, and they're trying to reduce those payments. The challenge in most industries, and we represent every industry you can imagine, is that doesn't exist. And the problem really comes back to this issue of communication and training. The reality is, let's say a payables person has no idea what procurement do, relatively speaking. They don't understand the challenges they have. And then also, if you look at procurement generally, most organizations have strategic procurement functions, which absolutely means they don't deal with every level of supplier. So there's always that level of supplier who falls through the crack. So ultimately, they go through a process of POs and no PO, no pay, etc. But do they really speak to a procurement professional? Do they get guidance and advice? Probably not. And I think they're the ones that sit in your world, Terry. They're the ones that need the education, the support. And it goes back a little bit to data as well. A lot of organizations struggle to segment their suppliers. So they're very keen on all the core suppliers that if they get switched off, their businesses fail. So in the supply chain, these are goods for resale suppliers. They're key, sort of electric, suppliers that would keep the lights on effectively, whatever they would be. But these small suppliers who have obviously, it's their livelihood, it's the people that pay, it's their wages. They have no way of segmenting those. They try wherever they can. So it's a little bit of data as well. And we hear and see this across every industry. It's not one specifically. Every industry have the same challenges, which is the quality of the information at the front end. It's the crap in, crap out process. The supplier onboarding process is so crucial because that's when procurement should be involved. That's the educating the supplier on what the terms really are and what the process is. If you don't get that bit done right at the beginning, don't try and fix it at the back end of the process because you're always up against it.
Yeah. And George, you're in a safe place now. That's good.
I'm in a safe place now, yeah. And that's the point I was making, where if you're dealing with suppliers who are just newly born or growing rapidly, cash is king for them. So we will try and come up with proactive terms where we can rapidly get to contract and pay them on terms that work for them. Now, you can adjust that in the broader ecosystem, but I think without that support, some of these companies just will never get off the ground. And whether the fairness point is whatever you state in your contract, as long as you stick to that and it's predictable and companies can borrow or manage their cash flow. And then the other consideration is clearly what do their customers do for them? So how quickly do they get the cash in at the other end? So you've got collections as well as payments, and the two of these things have to work hand in glove.
Yeah. How do though if procurement is bonused on, let's say, cash saved, just plain English, regardless of how much data you give or encouragement, unless the bonus point is changed, Alex, you're not going to get a behaviour change, are you? Because what gets measured gets done. And so how would you change that?
So I wouldn't say that procurement are bonused on cash. They're measured on it, and often the business has cash bonus targets, especially in manufacturing. And the problem happens is if you have a product, for example, that contains large commodities, which can have big swings, and it's a large part of your spend, then the profitability and cash of that company can have huge swings in either direction. And it's certainly not something that procurement are involved with when it comes to non-payment. Now, the targets often on days payables are often set from the company. We need to improve our cash position by X next year. That's the target, and it's been set out by so sales need to shorten their terms, and procurement need to extend them. But then there are countries where there are legal limits of what you can and can't do, and there are industries where you have limits of what you can and can't do. So France has rules around logistics, for example. I don't think there's a single procurement person that would want to extend payment terms, because and they want to pay them on time, and they don't want complications in the process, and they don't want payment holds. The loyalty that comes from treating a supplier like a partner, as George has just described, it has a huge value to a procurement function. And we talk about value a lot, and you destroy that value. That trust goes when you start asking for unreasonable things. And George is lucky that he works for a company with the right culture that allows him to set the right rules. But there are many companies, sadly I think George is in the minority, because that's why Accenture and McKinsey are all out there, promising we can improve your cash position by 300 million, and there's a huge chunk of it that is just around extending your payments. And often they come in with policies where they'll just write to every supplier and tell them. That happens a lot in industry, where they'll just get your whole supplier base and they'll write to all of them and say, we're changing your payment terms. And yes. It absolutely happens. We've just lost George.
Maybe he's on his way back. He might be on his way back to the office. And so how did we end up? Because this is not a problem unique to the UK, of course. But if I look across all the European countries, how did we in the UK end up being 26th out of 30th in terms of slow payments in Europe, do you think? Is there something particularly unique? Jamie, do you want to take that one about UK being a bit more stingy than other countries in Europe?
Not necessarily. I mean, look, in our world, payables is payable around the world. So the process to process an invoice is exactly the same. What normally happens in every part of the world is local legislation, some sort of tech, and maybe some cultural stuff that goes on in the different regions. Now, in terms of the chart, because I know you love a good chart, Terry, because we're sort of way down the bottom as a UK, it could be for a number of reasons, but I don't think it fixes the issue, to be honest. So even if we're at the top, and I think going back to Alex's point, these issues have been there for a long, long time. And I don't, for instance, when I was a CPO at a large construction organization, we were challenged on cash a lot because of the nature of the business we had. Very tight margins, but we were challenged a lot. But we would communicate across the business about what that meant. So, for instance, if we were not going to pay suppliers and we were going to have that infamous month 13 at the year end, so we're going to go into that month 13 where we're going to extend payment terms a bit, what we would also do is tell our suppliers early doors. So we would tell them in advance that, yes, okay, look, we need to stretch the payment terms for that month, not across the year, because that's the challenge. If you're a small supplier and you can't guarantee regular payments from your larger suppliers, then you have no business. You really don't have a business. So what we would do, definitely in the construction world, is tell them in advance if that was going to happen. But it wouldn't be a regular thing. We wouldn't be using supply chain finance in terms of not paying our suppliers, because let's be honest, the cost of interest has shot up, but that shouldn't be a strategy. And if organizations are using their suppliers as funding options, well, they're the ones that you should focus your attention on. And it sounds like in George's world, it's completely opposite. They're trying to be fair. They're really pushing the payment terms to get down to sort of 11 days, on average to pay is immense. And as somebody that looks across every industry, as we do, we represent thousands of sort of customers and suppliers, 11 is amazing. But how do we get other organizations to replicate what George and Lloyds are doing? And I'm guaranteeing it comes from the very top. Somebody at Lloyds is, at the very top, are sort of understanding the value of supply chain, looking down the supply chain, and it doesn't matter whether it's the window cleaner to, I don't know, the guy that puts your systems in, the ERP systems or the procurement systems. Everybody's treated fairly, and also it's in a consistent manner. And I'm guessing that's where George comes in, because it sounds like he does that across every one of the suppliers that
Yeah,
deals
I think
with
that's spot on, Jamie. And I think this point of fairness has been absolutely clear. When you contract what you're going to do and then do it. Say what I'm doing and then do what you say. And if we could get to that, irrespective of the terms, the number of days, that's a massive step forward. I think it's the uncertainty and the inconsistency that causes the major issue. And I think because of us being a bank, we are somewhat uniquely placed in having clients, as well as suppliers often being the same. And we can have conversations on both sides of that coin, where we look to understand, credit financing, for example, as a product and a proposition we offer, where there are gaps in the market. But when you look at the economic case for any arrangement, it's predicated on your cost of goods, which is a whole bunch of factors, people and supply chain. They're the two costs that ultimately you have in a business. And then how quickly can you get the money in versus you have to give the money out? And the person that manages that cash flow is crucial, particularly in small to medium enterprises. And I think where Terry's going with his efforts over the last 4 years has really shone a light into the darker corners of bad practice. I think there's another point to recognise that because of the overall ecosystem design in the UK, I think one of the challenges is small suppliers not paying other small suppliers. It's just not big corporates not paying small. So I think all of us have to take a look and a step back and see where we can, educate, put in automation, improve the consistency and the flow. I mean, I guess many of your team, Jamie, will be running about trying to find invoices in drawers that have been forgotten about, trying to match up errors on a digit out somewhere on a purchase order versus an invoice. All of these things from a triage point of view are so important to get right and to motivate people by doing good. And what we try and do is not for anything other than the genuinely held purpose we have to help Britain prosper, but also commercially. For us, it makes sense, because when you get into a tight spot with a supplier on demand, or they've got a new technology or a new process, or you want their smartest people, they look at you in the round and say, well, you do good here and there, but you don't pay us very well. That should be an increasing differentiator for me as a supplier to a buyer, to say we need that to improve and have that dialogue and confidence. And I think it falls upon us in the procurement community to really encourage that and have open conversation to ensure that happens.
And now, George, a whole bunch of companies, because people think about Lloyds Bank and Lloyds Bank, they just say Lloyds Bank as one, but it's a whole bunch of companies in that Lloyds banking group. Almost all of them, by the way, win our annual Fast Payer Awards, which is one of the reasons I wanted George to join. But regardless of being a bank versus, say, manufacturing, there must be something in here about the leadership point, which is it's actually quite tricky for, let's say, a CFO of a group company to say, we're going to pay everybody in, pick a number, doesn't matter what the number is. That then cascades down to the company boards and then the management teams and then the managers who manage the... How do you get that all working? Because that's a complicated thing to make work, isn't it, to get to 11 days?
I think it comes back to, ultimately you hear a lot of it being a purpose-driven organisation, but you have to genuinely do what you say. Now, if part of our core purpose is helping Britain prosper, within Britain there are hundreds of thousands of small to medium enterprises as well as large corporates. And the research we did demonstrated the benefit in making sure we fairly treated them in all regards of our interactions, core of which is paying on time and paying earlier if we possibly can. What we ask back in return is, from that tops down messaging coupled with the enterprise investment we've made in technology, and we work with various third parties out there to make a really slick process work most of the time, is the people at the edge. So the more junior colleagues who have to deal with the really tough to resolve invoices are motivated to understand why all of that work they're doing matters at the end of the day. So we tell stories, we showcase, the awards we get from yourself and others, and we just keep reinforcing that point that we have to get better. And I want to be paying 100% of invoices on time. We met other companies out there that have achieved that. It is possible. and they're not just in banking, they're in all sorts of different sectors. And one of the colleagues I met at the event we went to the House of Lords recently was telling me how their suppliers reward their customers because of how they treat them, principally on payments and fairness. So their customers are getting bonuses from the suppliers. So it's a very unique, and that's in the holiday industry, leisure market. So it's quite a fascinating insight to say, if you treat people fairly and consistently, they'll go that extra mile for you. And that has to be worth something economically, commercially to your organization.
Yeah, and this is going to go from the back office to the front office, of course, because we all know that the regulations are changing. There will be secondary legislation this year and primary perhaps next year, if the government stays on track, of course, around putting payment performance into annual reports. And this is going to mean that all the stuff that is a bit of a pain in the backside to send to DBT around payment times and what have you is going to have to be published in the annual reports, which is going to mean that procurement or finance or someone's going to have to get the numbers checked, because the CEO will want to make sure they're absolutely right if they're being printed in there. And all the stories that we've just talked about will be easier to tell, and it'll be easier to see where the bad players are. George, do you relish that?
Yeah, definitely. I think all of us should, right? Because there's nothing better than a league table to encourage competition and reflective comparisons with your peer group within an industry, and then which industries are going to be the best or the worst. And, you know, the gold, silver, bronze is really simple. You know the metrics. And I think the government just have to follow through on everything they've said, right? To shine a light where there are difficulties, and forums to establish where we can learn and listen and share. Because money makes the world go round. And I think within the UK, you just look at the economic challenges we've all got. And we've got international supply chains and many UK headquartered businesses. So it's a very complex, tangled world. And the more we can do to make the money flow fairly, the better, right? It has to be good for growth. It has to be good for confidence and ultimately economic prosperity.
Now, I have noticed in the participants list, our colleague Philip King online. Philip is the sort of inventor, if you like, of what used to be called the prompt payment code. It was introduced a while ago and scrubbed out a couple of months ago and replaced by something new called the Fair Payment Award. And I wonder, I don't know if Philip can speak, but maybe he can type. I've got a question around, what do we think about this new Fair Payment Award? And while Philip's sharpening his pencil, Jamie, you raised your eyebrows at least anyway. What do you think about prompt payment code versus fair payment code, and how do we measure it?
Yeah, look, so just before Christmas, we had Liz Barkley join us at the House of Lords for our strategic beef. There's Phil. Hey, Phil. There you go. He's on call. So let me give my view before we get to the expert's view, Phil. So we were lucky to have Liz, who's the Small Business Commissioner, join us and give us detail on the difference, if you like, the variance between what was once the prompt payment code and now the fair payment code. And it all comes down to the different levels, the sort of the structure they've got in place now. So everybody can absolutely put themselves forward as it's a voluntary code, but actually there's a process, there's an adherence, there's accountability now as the process goes. So all the great work that Phil started with in terms of the idea behind the prompt payment code, no doubt, was a cultural, behavioural, it was a process, it was driving organisations to do the right thing. But because it was voluntary, you can't really hold people accountable. So a lot of you people were using the code, obviously, to win contracts, which is fair dues. Now, what Liz has tried to introduce now is a sort of a bronze, silver, gold approach, which means the fairer you are, the sort of the more applicable to sort of George's point, where you are practicing what you preach and vice versa, you will naturally go up the league table. So I think, you know, culturally, I think it's a good thing. I think it's going to be hard to manage because it's carrot and stick, isn't it? The reality is it's still voluntary. You still can sort of go on that code if you wish. Whereas on the other side, which is going to be sort of led a little bit by what you have to do from a legislation point of view, that's where the reality comes to, because then it's the consequence. What happens if your payment reportings are rubbish? You know, you're not adhering to, your processes aren't great, and your people aren't trained. That's where that will come from. But it would be lovely to see the two combining somewhat. So that's my view. But the experts on the call with us now. Over to you, Phil.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to everybody. Good to see you. And I've been listening with interest to what you've been saying. Thanks, Terry, for inviting me to comment. As you say, I was the sort of inventor or architect of the prompt payment code back in 2008 when we were in the credit crunch and Peter Mandelson was looking for a way to get cash back into the economy. And I'd be the first to accept that it was probably time for change. It had been around for a long time. It had got 5,000 signatories, which wasn't a huge number. And there was quite a lot of disrepute around it. And it wasn't held in particularly high regard by particularly small businesses. There are two reasons for that, in my view. One is that government didn't adequately support it. One of the things that I know over the time I was running it was that when the minister spoke about it, we suddenly saw a spike in signatories. And ministers spoke about it far less often than they could or should, and therefore we didn't see consistent spikes as we'd have liked to. And I could go through about 10 business ministers that were involved in the code, some of whom were really supportive and good, some of whom had little interest in it, and I think that was one of the downfalls. The other one was that the changes that we announced and to the code signatories in 2021, just before I ended my time as interim small business commissioner, never really got implemented. And some of those requirements were stronger than what's in the Fair Payment Code and awards, but they weren't done. And the thing that was missing for me was the removal of the suspension program, where we suspended people from the code where their payment practice reporting data demonstrated they weren't compliant, and we didn't let them back on again until they worked through a program to improve their payment record, and that was significantly successful. We saw, tens of businesses removed with a large amount of publicity and PR, and then we saw a significant number come back on after they've worked through. And I'm sure people involved won't mind me saying that Kia was one of the companies that we did a huge amount of work with to get their payment record much better and to get their group companies back on. As far as the Fair Payment Code is concerned, James is right. The aspirational element of moving from bronze to silver to gold, I think, is a good thing to do. I question whether businesses that can only apply for gold will really want to, because they will have a concern that perhaps they don't want to be seen as a sort of second-tier citizen. And I think we have to get the mindset right around people trying to join. I'm concerned about the resources available in the Small Business Commissioner's office. They're offering a huge amount of support to businesses wanting to sign up, but we know that resources are always difficult, and will the sufficient resources be available? And the other thing that I noticed, I'm a small business in my own right, and I tried to sign up. I signed up to the Prompt Payment Code when I first formed my business. I tried to sign up to the small business, the Fair Payment Code, and it's really difficult for me because I have to have a supplier of over 50 employees. I have to have a business of less than 50 employees. I have to get references from them. I pay everybody that I have to pay, and that, frankly, is just my accountant, my tax advisor, and occasionally a couple of other people. And I always pay them instantly once I get their invoice. So I know that I am a good payer, but there's no way I can get onto the code because I don't have sufficient track record to do that. Now, I'm probably not the target audience for the code, and so that's fine. But I wonder whether they should have made that clear when they were launching it. All in all, I think it's the right time for change. I like the aspirational element. I hope the enforcement element is as strong as it needs to be and gets carried through, and the SBC has the resources to do that. And I wish it well. I have some doubts, but I would love to be proved wrong over the next year or two and see it make a real success of improving payment culture. If I will, finally, I'll say that the one thing the Prompt Payment Code did was to get payment onto the agenda where it hasn't previously been there. And I had numerous opportunities talking to the media and radio and so on about what it was trying to do. And the more we talk about payment, the better it will be. And I echoing what George said earlier around payment terms aren't as important as certainty. And certainty for small businesses is absolutely the key. If they know they're going to be paid on day 35 and payment arrives on day 35, then they're fine. if it arrives on day 45, they've got a 10-day gap in their cash flow, and that can be fatal. So I think, you know, if we get some certainty into the cultural element of payment, that would be great.
Thank you, Philip. I want to move on to opportunity cost, as a consultant would talk about. It was a horrible phrase, but I learned it at Accenture, goodness knows why. Any other comments on fair payment award before we move on? Alex?
Yeah, just to build on what Philip's just said, I think we need to make sure that there's a balance between the consequence of non-adherence. If it's an emotional tie, sadly there aren't as many companies like Lloyds, like George, that morally think it's the right thing to do. In 15 years ago, we had a culture through the early 2000s where things were going the other direction. I spent 6 years as VP of Sales and Marketing, and during that period, I was selling beverage cans to large global drinks manufacturers, and I had brewers that were sending tenders out that don't even bother responding unless you agree to the 270-day terms. Okay, so we've had this period of time where we were chasing it up and chasing it up and chasing it up, and now we're trying to bring it in another direction. And so we can all have this belief that it's the right thing to do, but when your 6 monthly and annual numbers drop and your share price goes up or down dependent upon your cash performance, it drives behavior. And sadly, we still need you guys to be banging the drum to get more companies like Lloyds doing the right thing, and getting CEOs measured on it, so as they can respond. But also the consequential management needs to get tougher, because without it, organizations will have a choice of, what's my share price going to do, or do I pay on time? And while those two things are there, sadly, a lot of people make the wrong choice.
Well, over the 4 years that we've been running the campaign, one thing I have noticed is that overall average payment times and the late payment percentages have been going down. Now, I have to caveat that with, it's all self-reported, right? And I know this numbers can be gained and everything, but what it tells me is that people think it's an important thing. I then get on to discussions like the one we're here, and no matter the seniority level or even the department, people are nodding their heads when they're saying, well, surely we should get faster or fairer payment and pay on time. And it's not just because it's the right thing, but because it's good for business, which is why we call it Good Business Pays, right? Because there's a good business story. We know that small business confidence in the UK is at rock bottom at the moment for all sorts of reasons. We also think and feel that they could be the engine of growth, or an important element of the engine of growth, to get the UK back out of a problem area. It won't do that, though, if it's strapped for cash, if it's got to pay its VAT bills, you know, it's invoiced somebody, it's got to pay VAT before it gets paid. So it's robbing Peter to pay Paul all the time. And there's an opportunity cost here, which the Accentures and the big consulting firms perhaps should be looking at, rather than the, can we stretch out the payment times, but how can we create growth from your supply chain? And George, I don't know whether you're on at the moment, but I know this is an area you care about, which is the missed opportunity cost. Do you feel that there's a different story we should be starting to tell around this, which is around opportunity rather than savings?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it needs to move on from the adversarial, you said you would pay, you didn't pay, to how do we resolve it? And if you zoom forward, right, if you look at blockchain technology and digital currencies, you get an immutable, immediate payment. It happened instantly, right? And I think eventually we'll get there. So we'll be paying each other through some sort of digital blockchain platform. There's, you know, platforms out there that, you know, I don't want to mention any particular brands, but some are very well established, operating at scale. And I think once that breaks into the mainstream, if you're not paying through that type of platform immediately, you're not going to get a place at the table. And I think the big question for the purchasers is, at what point does the power shift flip So if you want to buy GPUs from a certain company in the world to build out your AI network, and you said, well, I'm going to pay you in these terms, and they go, well, actually, we want to pay paid in 10 days. You don't have a choice. If you want what they have as a rarity or something that differentiates for your business, I think the power will switch. So a combination of more digital currency payments, which will become inevitable through a digital pound or dollar or whatever that means is, through that blockchain network, we'll see immediacy coupled with the power swing shift to suppliers from buyers. I think these two things will make this issue go away. I'm not quite sure when. So in the meantime, we have to roll our sleeves up, be fair, be clear, triage, run at this, help fix it. And to Jamie's point earlier, where cash flow is king and he's working up at Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve to get money in the door, that shows you just how important it is to the life or death of companies and therefore the UK economy ultimately.
Yeah. And final question, I'm going to go around the table a little bit, but George, to you, you are at the top of the tree. We talked about leadership and people make the decisions on how things happen. You are at the top of the tree in Lloyds Banking Group. Given all of this, given everybody wants to pay faster, what does procurement as a function need to do to try and push this agenda?
Well, the first thing I do is in our policy out there is state our intentions to current and any suppliers that want to work with us. So our reputation in the supply market matters a lot and we trade on it. The second thing then is to work with my colleagues in finance to make sure we've got a full enterprise end-to-end viewpoint of when we generate a purchase order, it's really clear in terms of the purchase order number, the quantity, the price, the VAT, everything that has to be on it. And then we make sure when we get the invoice in, it can electronically be matched immediately. And then we have that back end triage. So it's constant messaging from the top. You know, our purpose is at part to make sure suppliers are paid on time, to contract terms and fairly, and we endeavour to resolve issues as and when they emerge. And it's working in partnership with finance and goods receiving and all of the key players in the organisation that make this happen. And every year we can then stand up and look our suppliers in the eye and say, here's how we've performed. And they will give us plaudits or otherwise. And you stand and fall by your performance. And ultimately, the awards that come out, whether it's gold, silver, bronze, will then reinforce that point with government and other key stakeholders. So key message from the top, prove it, deliver on your commitments. I think that's the key, Terry, really.
Yeah. Jamie, running the AP organisation, from your view, same question. What does AP need?
Again, so across payables and procurements, I mean, again, what I would say is that the time for talking should stop. The time for action should be more in sort of people's eyes, and sort of agreeing with George to a certain degree that the reality is what gets measured gets sort of the results come out from what gets measured. I think we do an awful lot of talking about what best practice might look like. It's time to action now, and I would say accountability. So the new prompt payment code going into the fair pay code, it's a good step forward. I do agree with Phil that ultimately how accountable people will be, and you know whether this is enough of a step, I don't know, but we do also welcome the accountability steps that the UK government are trying to take in terms of the payment processes, making people follow through on what they're saying they do. So rather than just report on average payments, actually are their processes and their payment processes fit for purpose? So it's time for action and accountability. That's what will make the difference in not only the economy, but in terms of the supply chain world as well.
Thanks, Jamie. Phil, any reflections, Philip, from you on what Jamie and George have said?
Only that I think this sits above procurement. So I think that the businesses that do this well, it's right from the very top. And the culture is that our suppliers are working in partnership with us. And we see them as partners, not a third-party entity, and we work with them. And if we have that mindset across the business in everything we do, then that will include payment, and treating them fairly will be part of that equation.
And of course, Alex, right, back to you for final comments.
Look, one of the reasons why we created the Alchemie Network was to tackle some of these issues globally, around ESG, around modern day slavery, and around things like this, prompt payment and fair payment. And I don't think there's a procurement person working that wouldn't agree that they want to create value and partnership with their suppliers. We need to fix the cultural business relationship, and we need to arm every procurement person with all of the tools, so as when they're faced with these problems internally, they can argue correctly of why it is reducing value for the business. George has been successful in doing it, but a lot of people aren't, and they get told, no, this is the target you must follow, and we need to fix that. The other thing that came to mind during this is one of the measures we need to have is every one of those very large consulting firms that is out there selling consultants, and they have specialists who just focus on payment terms and cash creation, but a lot of it is around evaluating your supplier list and saying, well, all of these suppliers, you can push them out. That they need to be on a blacklist, and if they are doing that and not separating out the smaller, medium-sized suppliers with the larger ones, then we need to have a question, because they've all got these teams that are going into large organizations and evaluating your supplier base and saying, you can improve your cash position by 80 million, do this. That should be stopped. It's but they're making a lot of money out of it.
Look at all you professional people nodding your heads when the blacklist was mentioned. Anybody who's a member of this network that wants to send me names to go on the blacklist, I'll create it. Don't you worry about that. Listen, this has been a fabulous first show. Thanks for sticking with us through the tech problems. And I think, according to Harold, we've broken a record by having 5 presenters on one screen for the first time in the Alchemie Network. So that's a good start to the year. Thanks very much.
There was no quiet as well. It was a false alarm up here, so positive.
Oh,
that's good to know.
Thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Cheers, Terry. Thank you. Bye bye.